Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and books. And this is going to be the second video talking about different ways to approach narrative and different ways to understand narrative, and some of the things that I do and my techniques. And one of the pieces of advice that frequently, if anyone asks me about how to understand or be better, I never phrase it as being better at reading, but you can build out a broader experience of narrative. And one of the ways of doing that, and the easiest way of doing that, is read varied texts. And a big thing when if you go to university and you study literature and you do an MA in literature and you do a PhD in literature, is that you start with a very broad base and you refine it and you refine it until you sort of specialize in one particular thing. But the biggest and most impactful thing in becoming more adept at analyzing and understanding literature is having a very broad diet of literature. Because if we focus solely on one major genre or one narrative type, then when we encounter things that don't follow the patterns in our head that have been established by reading that particular thing, that can be very difficult to grasp. It can be difficult to articulate why it's not resonating. And this brings me into the topic of this, which is reader expectations. In understanding narrative, reader expectations are perhaps the biggest thing when it comes to understanding and engaging with narrative. If you have read solely science fiction and only science fiction, and within that genre, you have only read space opera, when you attempt to read something that is not space opera, you can struggle because it's not conforming to your expectations about how a narrative should function. If you read only Gothic novels from that period, if you're reading only Gothic novels and then you try to read a modern horror text, which is, the grandchild of the Gothic movement, you might struggle because it's not doing the things in the same way that a Gothic novel does. If we read fantasy literature and we read only sort of literary fantasy, and then we try to read an adventure fantasy or heroic fantasy or a sword and sorcery fantasy or a sword and sandal fantasy or an epic fantasy or a high fantasy or a low, there are so many subgenres. There are so many different categories of fantasy. But if we read only literary fantasy and then we apply that, what we know about fantasy, saying, oh, it's all based on what literary fantasy does, that gives us a very particular impression of how narrative functions, what the narrative is in the fantasy genre. If we read only epic fantasy, which is the type of fantasy that I enjoy personally, that's my favorite form of fantasy. If I read only epic fantasy without reading anything else, then when I read an epic fantasy that is trying to do something different, what might happen is, instead of identifying, oh, they're using that technique to do this, and this is going to be interesting because I can see what they're doing, I might go, this is bad because it's not doing the thing properly. And so reader expectation, what we bring before we get to the text, can be so important in whether or not we enjoy a text. So I'll give you a very simple example of this. If we read Jane Eyre, if we read Pride and Prejudice, if we read Wuthering Heights, if that's the style of book that we read, we are used to to describe them as slow novels. They're not slow novels. They have a different sense of what pacing should be. They are character driven. They are theme driven. They are explorations of society. They are romances. They have all of these different elements that are interwoven. They are of a certain time and a certain place and a certain style. And if that's what we read, Those are our expectations. And then if we read, say, David Gemmell, we'd be going, but this is all action packed. Where's all of the character development? Where are these things? And it would be a very frustrating read because it's not doing the thing that we expect from the books that we love. So then reverse that. If we have a fantasy novel and we're enjoying it because it's all about these big narrative events, it's about these big narrative battles, and we're going, oh, this is fantastic, and then this guy goes and does this, and then, oh, he's been betrayed, and oh, wow. There are a lot of events to it. There's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of action. There's a lot of stuff happening, a lot of narrative events. The thing that I was talking about in the previous video that narrative is constructed of, it's all about the narrative events. And then we obviously are built into that. You have the satellites that deal with characterization, that deal with all of these things to flesh it out. But the balance between action, the action, the events, the exciting things happening, that is very, very important in epic fantasy. And then when we look at something like Jane Eyre or something like that, those big action set pieces, there aren't any. It's all here. But in terms of characterization, in terms of even world building, people don't think that a lot of novels, Regency romances and things like that have world building, but they're all about creating a world view. And there's a lot of world building in those. It's very, very different, but it's done in a different way. So if our expectations about pacing are based solely on one form of narrative, when we encounter, even within that form of narrative, someone using a different form of pacing, using something, say, from the Regency style, that can be very frustrating. And we go, this book is bad. But it's not that the narrative is bad. In a lot of instances, it's because the narrative is not conforming to an expectation we have about how narrative should progress. And if you take something like Daniel Abrams' The Long Price Quartet, these are beautiful, lyrical, and quite often very slow narratives. And, we have shorthand, we go, oh, it's a slow burn. The pacing of The Long Price Quartet is very different to the pacing of Mark Lawrence's Broken Empire. They're entirely different books. They're approaching narrative in a different way. When you look at the pacing of Tigana by Guy Gavriel Kay, and you compare it, say, to the pacing of Jim Butcher's The Dresden Files, again, radically different pacing. Is one form of pacing better than another form of pacing? And you go, and this is where you get into an evaluative judgment. And quite often it is colored by our reader expectation. It is a personal opinion. It's our expectation about how this narrative should function. And we can say with absolute certainty, clarity, and authorization, if you need it, this did not work for me. It was too slow. Absolutely fine. But if we change that criticism to the pacing is bad, that's where we can run into problems. Because quite often, how pacing is perceived is a lot to do with reader expectation. And you don't have to agree with me on this, but if we take books where you go, the pacing is uneven, you go, pacing should not be a sine wave, because then it is entirely predictable. And you're writing to a narrative pattern that once you understand that narrative pattern, the pacing is entirely predictable. Does it work for certain narratives? Yes, if you watch a lot of Hollywood blockbusters, they have opening sequence tends to be initially a tiny, slow bit to start, then big action. And then we get character building moment and setting up the story, then big action. And then we have repercussions and character building moment, and then big action. And then we have, oh, we're now going to do this thing and we're building towards the conclusion, big action. They follow that pattern. It's not complicated. And in fact, when you're watching it, you can go, I can time my bathroom break because this is just going to be the sequence where it's two guys punching each other in the face for 10 minutes. I can have my bathroom break, go and get more popcorn, come back, and I'm not going to have missed anything important about the story or about the plot or about the narrative because it's just them punching each other. It's just CGI action. And that is, pretty much empty narrative. There's nothing there. It's just an action sequence. They're chewing gum for the eyes. Is it exciting? Yes, for some. But it doesn't have any narrative content. It's all about the spectacle. So pacing and narrative content are not the same. So when we talk about whether something is subverting narrative, subverting reader expectation, subversion in and of itself is a tool. Subverting narrative expectation can be the author critiquing the genre, critiquing the style, critiquing any of those things. It can be to generate a surprise effect. It can be to create a different feeling in the reader. There are different ways subversion can be used as a tool, but subversion generally only works when there is an expectation about what should happen, and when it doesn't happen, that is subversion. And if an author is doing it just for shock value, just as a trick, it can feel very hollow. It can feel very artificial. They only did that solely to, subvert something. But you can use subversion to do interesting things. When we talk about narrative conclusions and narrative closure, the reader expectation that narrative closure always has to be within, let's talk specifically about fantasy, within epic fantasy, that has to be these big battles. And you go, why does it have to be a big battle? Oh, because that's a great, it's a titanic clash, and then, oh yeah, it's exciting. But surely everything boiling down into the moment between two characters, where everything has been distilled into the fight between these two characters. Think of Troy, the battle between Hector and Achilles. That battle has resonance. That battle has power, because it's not just about the Trojans and the Greeks. That has been distilled. They are symbolized. Their sides are symbolized by these two characters. There are all of these different things going on, different ways that you can do it. And if our expectation is that it has to do something, then we can be disappointed. So we look at it instead of, it didn't do that thing. Because if it has not met our expectations, we think of it as something it has not done. It becomes a negative. It becomes a negative frame of mind. Instead of looking at, what did it do, which is positive. In film editing, when you're constructing a film, you can talk about editing as, we have this whole thing, and then we're going to cut away and cut away and cut away until we get down to the essence of the narrative that we want to tell. And that's one way of looking at editing, that you pare everything back to create the streamlined narrative, that you've gotten rid of anything that is detracting from the narrative that you're trying to tell. Or you can look at editing as montage of building, where you take all of these different scenes and you build a narrative out of them to go, this is the narrative I'm telling. And it is a creative idea. It's looking at, this is what I'm constructing along the way. Both those are, absolutely normal techniques used in the film industry. But their mindset is entirely opposite. And you can use both techniques and come up with exactly the same film. That someone using the montage technique and someone using the editing technique, where they are paring away and they are building, they could end up with exactly the same product. It's entirely possible. But the mindset that they went into it is very, very different. One is trying to chip everything away to get to a core story. The other is building and trying to create a story out of all of these disparate elements. So when we read, our expectation that it should be following a set pattern, or it should be doing these things, can greatly affect our engagement with a text, because we are applying an external set of criteria to the narrative and judging it on whether it meets our expectations or it doesn't, instead of reading the text for what the text is doing, and then at the end evaluating, going, it was interesting the way they did that. It didn't work for me. Absolutely fine to do that. But it is a different way of looking at it, because you, instead of, and we'll go back to pacing, this section is really boring, the pacing is all off, nothing happens. Clearly something did happen. You've just read 50 pages, something happened. What you mean is a big event didn't happen. but there was dialogue, there were small moments, there were character moments, there were world building moments. That stuff happened. But for you, that mightn't be important. For you, that's not what you're going through in terms of the plot. For you, you want all of the narrative events. You want a more streamlined narrative. And you could say, oh, well, if you cut away that extraneous material, it would have been a shorter, more concise, much more deliberate novel that got to the point more quickly. It was more, it could have been more economical. It could have told the story faster. You go, yes. But is that the experience that the novel was trying to give you? Whether or not you appreciate what the novel is trying to give you, different thing entirely. But reader expectations about what you're getting out of it can seriously color our view of what a narrative does. So if you've experienced and read huge amounts of narrative, different types of narrative from all different places, that is one of the best educations you can get to actually enjoy more narrative, because you're used to these different techniques and you're not expecting a certain narrative pattern, and you can be more appreciative and enjoy other narrative patterns. And when we have that, when we don't have an expectation about the specific style of narrative we should be getting on the page, if we have a broad range of different narrative techniques that we've been exposed to, we are more likely to engage with what the narrative is doing than getting frustrated about what the narrative is not doing. Your mileage may vary. But thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.